Thank you.
Thank you so much, Graham. Thanks everyone for being here, or being there, depending on whether you're in London or elsewhere taking part today. I mean, I think we're every bit as, we're sort of guilty of using the clusters as a code for, or a sort of cipher for humanitarian action, because we didn't really set out to look at so we've lured everyone here under false pretenses. We didn't really set out to look at the clusters. We set out to look at coordination. And for reasons which I'll explain in just a second, we alighted on the clusters as a good way of looking at coordination and humanitarian response. I mean, I think it is almost self-evident, but in a system like the humanitarian system, although people would say it's not a system or an ecosystem or whatever you should call it anyhow, in this large grouping of humanitarian organizations, where you've got lots of organizations, often many of which will have very little background in an area, conducting very similar sort of responses in same geographical area, working with the same populations, there is massive potential for things to get messed up, for things to overlap, for things to duplicate, for gaps to open up. And so coordination is a very, very big issue for us, because the structure of the way that humanitarianism has evolved means that if you can't do, and as responses in many places, not all, but in many places get bigger, if you can't do coordination right, you basically can't do humanitarianism right, because it is going to be the sum of its parts. And so, or ideally more than, but at least one would hope it is not going to be less than the sum of its parts. And without coordination, of course, it very often will be less than the sum of its parts. So this coordination thing really matters. And so really the question that we set out to answer, Leah and I, and the rest of the ALNAP team set out to answer, was if coordination matters in the very specific circumstances of humanitarian responses, what is it that makes coordination work? What lies behind good coordination? That was it's not how we phrased the research question, but that was kind of how it developed for us. Now, we then needed to find a sphere of action where coordination was taking place that we could consider. And the sphere of action that we ended up looking at was, of course, the clusters, for a variety of reasons. And I think the reasons are worth sharing, because they back up a lot of what Graham was saying just now. First of all, if you want a single, if you like, structure which has been rolled out in all sorts of very different circumstances to do often really quite different things, despite the fact that on paper it's the same thing. But if you want a very flexible global coordination structure where you have enough cases to kind of get a sense of what the varieties and similarities might be, the clusters are a very good one to take, because there are a lot of clusters around. Secondly, we took the clusters because there'd already, as Graham suggested, been quite a lot of research and evaluation into the clusters, so we knew that there was somewhere to start, that we had a basis, at least for the literature review. Thirdly, we decided to focus on the clusters because there is and I think for that decade-long period, and even before the clusters, because the clusters existed before the clusters existed, as it were. There were clusters on the ground long before they were formalised within ISC guidance. The one thing that's been notable about the clusters seems to have been, in very many cases, a real appetite for learning and change. And so we thought that it would be good to work with clusters because they were probably going to be more interested in the results than perhaps some other coordination bodies might be. And finally, I think it's important to say that we weren't looking at whether or not the clusters were successful. That was not the research question, how well are the clusters done. What we did need was we needed a coordination mechanism where we could see there had at least been some examples of success, so that we could say, what is it that leads to success? Because, of course, if we took a coordination mechanism which had always consistently failed, then we weren't going to get very far with the research. And essentially, for all of the very legitimate, I'm sure, very legitimate complaints that are made about elements of, cluster coordination, and I think Leah might touch on some of those when she talks about what works and what doesn't, overall, the clusters are consistently evaluated as basically working around the issues of gaps and overlaps, around that coordination issue. Some do better, some do worse, but of the evaluations, external evaluations that we looked at, and I think it came to around 30 or something in the end, the majority of them, a significant majority of them, suggested that in that particular case, the cluster had been successful. So that was good for us, because it meant that we could actually identify its work. So what was it that made it work? So we didn't set out to look at the clusters, but the clusters is where we ended up. And I think the reason that we ended up there says quite a lot about the cluster system itself. So I always really hate it when people do stuff with definitions, but I think it is necessary here to kind of define this coordination thing, because it's talked about so very much. It's because of the nature of the atomized system, you're going to get a lot of discussion about things that bring those different atoms of the system together. And they are often called coordination, but sometimes they're called other things. Sometimes they're called collaboration, or partnership, or interoperability. But often the term that's used is coordination. And so we start with this coordination thing. What is this coordination? Well, it's take this definition. It's as good as any other, the one you can see on the screen. And what I think was interesting, looking back on the many interviews and the work and the many very interesting people that we've had the opportunity to talk to about this, is that we came from a place where we assumed that, okay, if that's what coordination is, just like sort of stuff like peace and love and drum solos and things, the more of it you have, the better it's going to be. So if that's coordination, if coordination is what is a kind of organisation of parts that leads to more effective work, then the more organisation you do, the more effective the work's going to get. So more coordination, our assumption was, is always going to be a good thing. The more you can coordinate, the better it's going to get. Does that make sense? It's kind of what we were thinking when we started. And we didn't even challenge that. We just sort of assumed that. And I find that interesting because I wonder, and we'll come back to this, but I wonder the degree to which we have all made that assumption in terms of the structuring of not only the clusters, but the HCTs and the inter-cluster coordination mechanisms and the general humanitarian coordination architecture. So maybe it's something we'll come back to. So we started with this more is better thing, and then as we looked, we started to see a sort of spectrum. That coordination wasn't a sort of undifferentiated set of relationships. There were lots of different kinds of relationships that were being called coordination, and that they lay, not perfectly, but for the purpose of argument, they lay along a broad spectrum. So if you look at the spectrum here, at either end you have two things which are definitely not coordination. At one end you have complete autonomy. You've got lots and lots of organisations doing whatever they like, with very little relationship between them. At the other, you have a merger, a situation where different organisations actually structurally and legally turn into being one organisation. The coordination bit, things that we've seen commonly called coordination, are the bits that kind of fall in the middle. And the terminology here is, I'm sure, not perfect, but it's a terminology. It's a tool to think with, that's all. So one sort of coordination, a fairly limited kind of coordination, is this communication level. And often when people say they're coordinating, what's actually happening is people are sharing information. Sometimes they're sharing information in order to create a joint bigger picture of what's really going on. But at this level, this communication level, people come together, they share information. There's no real expectation or obligation that they will do anything. You tell me something about what you're doing in a district. I say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I act on it, maybe I don't. No one really expects me to do anything with it. But it's a kind of coordination. At the next level, and these kind of smear a little bit, they move from one into another. But at the next level, you have organisations which are still very autonomous, doing different kinds of program, different things, but they are prepared to make adjustment to the thing that they're doing so that it will fit better with the thing that's happening next door. So these are different programs that we have going. Maybe they're the similar program in geographically different but adjoining areas. Maybe they're in the same area, but they're sectorally different programs. And whilst we maintain organisational autonomy, we will maybe take on the same sort of operating procedures, the same sort of standards, just so that we're kind of aligned. Or maybe we will agree that I'll work here and your organisation will work there, so we're geographically aligned. And this is the kind of coordination that we saw as alignment, you know, basically maintaining a high level of autonomy, but changing things in order to fit better. And then at a higher level of coordination, you had collaboration, and that's where the independence or the autonomy of the organisation, rather than doing lots of separate things in parallel, you're moving towards essentially working together on the same thing. So this is where it's much more likely that you will have one sort of, one overarching strategy. You'll have often not only your location, but your location and your procedures and your priorities will have been put together, and you'll be working, the two organisations will be working much more closely. It's not yet a full organisational merger, but essentially, rather than separate organisations working on separate things, it looks a lot more like separate organisations working on the same thing. And of course, these are not entirely discrete categories. There are many places in between. Within any cluster, you will see that actually often different organisations within the cluster think that they are doing different things, that they are in that room to do different things along this line. And often they'll be right, because certain sorts of activities will tend to be more off towards the right. Typically, we found advocacy and evaluation, whereas operations and responses will tend to be more down to the left. Yeah? So there's a lot of movement even within this, but we thought it was a useful typology, because what we found was that all organisations were thinking about collaboration within a typology slightly like this, coordination within a typology slightly like this, and they were basically balancing out what the costs and the returns. Yeah? And the costs, of course, of taking part in something like this are you're giving up autonomy, you're often giving up visibility, in terms of your visibility of what you've done to attract further funding in the future. You may well be giving up significant amounts of time to take place in the coordination mechanism. So these are a lot of costs on the organisation. But on the other hand, the benefits are you're reducing gaps and overlaps. You're reducing conflict, potentially, because of those gaps and overlaps. You're obtaining best practices. And very often, you also get a sense of the whole picture of what's going on that's very difficult to do if you're not actually at the cluster table. And this, time and time again, this rather nebulous idea of it gives us a sense of what's going on came back as a benefit. So how do you weigh the costs and benefits, and where does it work best? Well, interestingly, if you recall, I was saying we assumed that the further you went towards collaboration, the better the coordination got. The research did not suggest that that was the case. The research suggested that the costs and benefits kind of peaked in most cases. You got the best bargain around alignment, and then the costs started to overwhelm the benefits as you moved into a more collaboration phase. And not only for the organisation, but potentially also for the affected population as well. Let me explain why we say that. We weren't sure, we could not say that more coordination is better after this research for three reasons. Firstly, because we really didn't find very many, or indeed hardly any examples where it was happening outside advocacy. And given it's not saying they're not there, we're just saying we didn't find them, because we didn't talk to every single cluster in every sector in every country. But we did talk to quite a lot. And you'd think if it made sense to do it, just through sort of organisational evolution, we would have found it somewhere, because we turned over enough stones. You'd think somewhere you'd find this happening. But we didn't, which is a clue that maybe there's a reason why people aren't doing that. So that was the first reason. Explicitly, the second reason was that a lot of respondents, although by no means all, suggested that in fact the cluster worked best when it didn't aim higher than this. the cluster coordination function was best achieved when it was about a broad sort of alignment that strongly recognised the autonomy of different organisations, but looked to decrease gaps and overlaps at the edges of the work that they did. And then the third thing, which I think is quite interesting, is, as many of you know, we've also been doing quite a lot of work around organisational leadership in complex environments. And what came out of that work, which we hadn't really expected to come into this work, but it sort of did, was in some ways what many of the clusters have done by doing this alignment rather than a sort of higher level, more unitary, more centralised level of coordination. What they've done is they've basically adapted themselves to what is good practice for a complex environment. Yeah? So rather than establishing a big centralized system of coordination where it all comes out of the capital city and the decision is made, what's happening is it's a much more decentralized set of organizations who are working within broad outlines, but within those broad outlines they're busking it, basically. They're working separately. And a lot of the work around working in emergencies suggests that this is actually a much more effective way to go. Now, I'll go back to that in just 1 second. Because, and to put a bit of flesh on the bones of that, maybe we can take the example of strategy and the way that it's meant to be done and the way it often seems to actually be done. On paper, the guidance around creating the country strategy is very classic. It's very much the classic orientation to strategy development, which is the clusters and other elements on the ground will get information about what's going on. All of that information will go to the pipe, to the central decision-making body, which has the overview of how things ought to be done, because the central decision-making body has to make the decisions about prioritisation of scarce resources. The central decision-making body, the HCT in this case, will actually decide, and when those decisions have been made, the strategy will go back down the pipe to the clusters and the operating agencies, who will implement. Yeah? So you have a kind of a strategy created, building up, coming from information that's provided on the ground, strategy developed at the centre, implementation back on the ground. And this is largely, and Laurie might, or others of you might disagree in a minute, but this appears to our reading to be very largely how the IASC expects strategy to be done. Which makes perfect sense, because that is how strategy is often done. It is the classical approach to strategy. What the clusters rather cleverly have done is that they've slightly subverted this. And so what appears to be happening in very many cases is that the agencies do what they think is the most relevant thing to do in the first 72 hours. And they begin their operations. They then sort of report on that and say that this is what we're doing. And the field realities from various different clusters and sectors come up to the HCT, where the HCT essentially creates a strategy which is the, if you like, the combination of all of the strategies which are already being enacted on the ground. So rather than the HCT setting the strategy that the HCT creates is very often a reflection of what's happening in response to the emergency. And the advantages of that, and you can think about this, I wouldn't take this too far, but you can think of this as the difference between a centralized command economy, which decides how many ball bearings are going to be made in Minsk, from the center, looks at the overall ball bearing requirement and says, okay, we need 20,000 tons of ball bearings from the Minsk factory, or a market economy where things are more flexible and are working more according to demand on the ground at any given time, and it's a more organic. And as I say, don't take that too far, but I think it's a useful way of thinking of it. And the advantages are quite obvious. It's quicker. You get quicker responses that way. You're not waiting for the strategy to go up and come down. And the decisions are being made much closer to where the needs exist, so the decisions are much more accurate. And ideally, it's more flexible and more able to respond to changing needs, this approach as well. So, going back to, just to finish my part before going over to Leah's part, we looked at what the clusters are doing, not at what they should do. But we looked at what the clusters are doing through the lens also of what we thought they should do. And what we discovered is what they are doing is a rather clever, in many cases, re-engineering of what de jure perhaps they should do. And the modest proposal that we would make is that maybe, rather than trying to change what they're doing to make it more like what's writ, what we should be doing is trying to change the, if you like, the policy to make it more like what the clusters are actually doing, because what the clusters are actually doing is perhaps better adapted to their reality than the more centralized approach. But this is a point of view based on our research. It's not based on every single cluster, and I recognize it is not universally popular, so maybe we'll be able to have a good old discussion about that in a minute. But first, Leah.